And joining me now is Norman Solomon. Norman, among other credits to his name, is the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, which is an excellent organization trying to keep the facts straight in the media in this country. He is also national director of Roots Action, and an activist and organizing group, and he is an author of a number of books well worth reading, the latest of which is War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. That book was published last year. It's come out in paperback with an afterword about the situation in Gaza and how that applies to his topic. So I wanted to get that update from him. And even since that afterward is published, things keep changing. So first of all, Norman Solomon, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks a lot, Richard.
So let me ask you this, first of all. You published this book, then the October 7th happened, then the attack on Gaza, and an enormously slanted media coverage. I mean, it's not to dismiss that, the atrocities of October 7th, but enormously slanted in terms of, I believe, and as your afterwards say, it's minimizing the violence and atrocities from the Israeli military. Did the obviously we didn't know this was coming. Did the extent of the bias in the U.S. media shock or surprise you? Because I've got to say, even though I've followed media bias for a long time, it did kind of overwhelm me a little bit.
Well, we should be shocked again and again. It's like that bumper sticker. If you aren't outraged, you're not paying attention. So, we certainly don't want to get jaded or say, okay, this is normal, even if it is sort of normalized. As you were speaking, I thought of the phrase unbalanced empathy, which seems to apply to media coverage, not only of the situation in Israel and Gaza in the last year, but actually it umbrellas the last few decades in terms of war. Empathy should be part of reporting. It should connect human beings to each other, good times and bad. But the imbalance is just so extreme. And that has been a continuity of US media coverage overall in terms of wars that either the US is waging directly or supporting or opposing one way or the other.
I think that's well said. I might add coin another phrase using the word empathy, which is the weaponization of empathy. It feels as if, especially in the first half of the past year, and of course we're coming up now on, we're about to mark a terrible anniversary, 1 year since all this began on October 7th, but it seems to me that a very selective and I don't know how to put it, but unbalanced, I guess is the right word, a level of coverage about the individual suffering of, certainly not proportionate to the numbers of people harmed, has fed a selective outrage. And it always seems to do that, Norman. And that to me is one of the subjects of the book overall. It makes me think, the terrible and now discredited story of babies being burned in ovens by Hamas was so similar to the discredited story of premature babies being snatched from incubators during the 1991 Gulf War. And it seems to me that these terrible stories are always somewhere along the line put together to promote war. Is that consistent with your observations?
Sometimes they're fabricated, and then sometimes they're simply accentuated, and the other ones are ignored. For instance, we know that Israel, the forces of Israel, are torturing Palestinians. Very rare to see that in the US media. When we look at ethnic cleansing, and certainly what Israel has been doing, not only in Gaza, but now more and more in the West Bank, meets the definition of ethnic cleansing. And if you look back at speeches, for instance, that Bill Clinton gave in 1999 at Arlington Cemetery and elsewhere, he said, we just, as Americans, cannot tolerate ethnic cleansing. Of course, he is talking about what was happening in Kosovo and trying to justify the relentless NATO bombing of Kosovo and Yugoslavia that the United States led with its Air Force. And so it's a sickening, disorienting kind of what Orwell would call doublespeak, and it's corrosive intellectually and emotionally. And I think that is a through line, unfortunately, with U.S. foreign policy and media coverage, the way in which war is presented in U.S. news media. And as the years and then decades go by, it's upsetting to look at how consistent the inconsistency is. What we really need, I think, as human beings, as leaders, as journalists, is a single standard of human rights. Otherwise, it's a bouncing ball of propaganda that is so manipulated. And Orwell defined doublethink as you take some facts or precepts, really, avowed principles, and you take them off the shelf and you invoke them and present them to the extent it's convenient. And then when it's not convenient, you throw them back on the shelf. In the afterword, I note the common proclamation from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, that we need a rules-based order. And Richard, you kind of have to wonder how he can say that with a straight face, since the real U.S. foreign policy is we make the rules and then we're going to break the rules whenever we want to. And being the most powerful military force on the planet, that's certainly within their capacity to do. A little side note irony that Antony Blinken was chief of staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Joe Biden was the chair in 2002. And in the middle of that year, they simply ran a bogus hearings about how the U.S. should relate to Iraq. And they didn't allow any testimony from people who would challenge the impending invasion. So this invocation of a rules-based order, I think, is symptomatic of, they're, not to get too colloquial, they're messing with our minds. It's a propaganda system that disorients people. And I think that is largely by design.
And it's a great point, and one that I think has a long-term, almost imperceptible corrosive effect on public trust and common understanding. Because I think that while people, yes, to use your colloquialism, may not know precisely when someone is messing with their minds, ultimately they come to distrust everything they hear. That's my theory anyway, that it engenders I don't want to overgeneralize, but that it can engender an overall distrust of what they hear from every source and sort of create fertile ground for what's now called fake news of all kinds. But to me, the so-called rules-based order is a key example of that. We had international institutions and international law invoked selectively, but invoked after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, illegal under international law, whatever the preceding history is. But in shouting about that correctly, that we failed to note our own violations of the world order in that part of the world and in that country. And then when Israel, which has been violating international law for many years now, does so even more egregiously and is, that's pointed out in court actions and arrest, discussion of arrest warrants and so on, all of a sudden, the rules-based order is not so important. I have a quote in a piece I was working on where one of the State Department officials actually says, Israel says, we have jurisdiction, not the UN. And then the U.S. official agrees. It says, well, Israel has jurisdiction, and to the extent that we have military there, we have jurisdiction too, which is as blatant a
Mm.
I'm paraphrasing, but as blatant a rejection of the world order as you can imagine, the
Yeah.
rules-based order. And it seems to me that besides the obvious hypocrisy, some of the collateral damage of that is to the U.S. global reputation and trust, and to internal trust that people can believe anything they're being told. But that's my take on it. What do you think?
I recently ran across the phrase that I guess has been bandied about in a while in so-called national security circles, escalation dominance. And this is a goal that they stay ahead of the pack. They are going to be the unipolar, the US government leaders are going to be leading a country that is always going to be way ahead in terms of escalation of military prowess, nuclear weapons, and military force. And so this was actually a challenge I had in looking at how to write an afterword while the history of the Gaza war was happening earlier this year, because I knew the paperback was coming out in the fall. And I thought of the subtitle, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, and really thought a lot about, well, how does that apply to the war on Gaza? And I concluded that the US military machine includes the Israeli military.
Mhm.
There's a side irony. We have something called, uppercase D Defense Department. Israel has something called the Israel uppercase D Defense Force, and ostensibly operating for defense. Of course, very little what they do has anything, I would say, to real defense. But the reality is that the massive Israeli Air Force, one of the most powerful in the world, and the overall Israel military do function as an adjunct to the United States military. And I hasten to add that they have different command structures. They're not always ordered or having the same policy goals exactly as each other. There are sometimes disagreements. I think there have been some genuine tactical disagreements between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden, but they're tactical disagreements. And so the overview is that we have these two militaries that function largely in tandem, and their goals, whatever titrated differences they have, are very similar. And so then think, well, what are these goals? Well, dominance in the Middle East, the biggest ally of the US, most powerful being Israel. And then when we get back to the selective empathy, it's explicit from the Israeli leaders, it's tacit from the US government leaders at the top. Palestinian lives don't really matter. What matters is Israeli lives. And this is a basic contradiction with the rhetoric. The policies in one place, the flowery language is somewhere else.
And those are two important points, Norman Solomon. One, the idea of the Israeli military machine as an extension of the U.S. military machine. It took me a while. You articulated it better than I have in my head, but generally that's where I've come over the last year. I wasn't there a year ago, but it seems to me there's talk and there's action. And the talk didn't even begin in earnest in this country, largely empty rhetoric, until it began to have a political impact in an election year. But even so, the action generally remains the same. As you and I speak today, and I should note, this is a fast-breaking story that we're recording on Thursday. As you and I speak, it seems clear that Israel's attacks on Lebanon, which have they killed the leader of Hezbollah, which is being widely celebrated. It's not legal, though. I mean, if we want to bring in that, and if you decapitate an organization, you can't negotiate with it anymore. So we could debate the wisdom of that. But it's one of the striking things about this is that for all the rhetoric that we've heard from the Democrats, at least, about about trying to solve this with a ceasefire, some sort of diplomatic solution. It seems to me, as I interpret things, that the bombing of Lebanon, even the potential for a ground invasion of Lebanon by Israel, has the tacit approval of the United States military machine, for lack of a better word, because all of a sudden President Biden, Vice President Harris are just saying Israel has the right to defend itself. 40,000 troops now in the region, more weapons sent. It seems to me that, if we wipe aside this thin film of dialogue, that this is an extent, this is the U.S. military machine either giving the go-ahead or encouraging an attack on another country. Do you think I have that wrong?
I think that's very accurate. And as is so often the case, there's a de facto two-track approach from the top of the U.S. government in terms of foreign policy. We had President Biden a few days ago asked about what Israel was doing in Lebanon. He was asked, "Are you comfortable with it?" And he said, "I'm comfortable with them stopping." But Politico reported at the same time that actually top people in the White House and the State Department were green lighting what Israel was doing in Lebanon. They want it to happen. And so ultimately, the policy is anti-diplomatic. It's clear and transparent, A, that Netanyahu wants Trump to win. B, he understands that the more bloodshed and commotion and upheaval he can create between now and election day helps Trump and undermines Biden and Harris and so forth. And the third point being that ultimate agenda of the leadership of the Israeli government is to create as much suffering as possible for its ostensible and or real enemies, the forces of Hezbollah, of Iran, the Houthis, and so forth. And one of the side notes, but I think important, is that Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen are reduced to Iranian proxies in the parlance of US media and politics. Well, they get some aid and help from Iran, but they're not clones from Iran. And there is such a thing, hard for the pundits in Washington to imagine, I think, there is such a thing as solidarity. And it doesn't seem to cross the minds or certainly the lips and the laptops of these pundits and reporters that maybe there are some people in Hezbollah and Houthis who really don't like to see Palestinians being slaughtered en masse and the US government helping that to take place day after day, month after month, and now we're entering the second year. So the idea of humanistic solidarity towards Palestinians seems to be antithetical to the mindset of the punditocracy in the US and the ruling forces of US foreign policy. But then you switch it around and it's all about, go to the tarmac, give a bear hug to Netanyahu, which is what Biden did last October. And this is, again, going back to the unbalanced empathy, which is completely symptomatic. We could go to the Vietnam War to this day, time after time, the US involved with the war. And among other things, and I write about this in the book, it's very corrosive ethically, morally, if you will, spiritually, and in terms of any kind of sensible political discourse, intellectually and emotionally. What is that for people? We're stuck with this normality of a double standard, to put it mildly, and it's so extreme that it's sort of, to mix metaphors, it's baked into the walls of the echo chambers.
Yeah, and to me, the idea that this selective empathy is part of a military process, what came to mind as you were saying that, you mentioned in the new afterword to the book, protest groups on campus. And that seems to me one of the other striking things about the last year to me is the extent to which you can call them pro-Palestinian or anti-genocide or whatever you care to call them, but to the extent that these protests on US campuses have met a military-like response, in the United States in 2024 has been striking to me. That, I've visited encampments and found to be extremely peaceful places filled with gentle people. There was a disinformation campaign around that. I saw both Jewish and Muslim services taking place out in the open there, in peace and solidarity. I didn't sense any anti-Semitism, unless you equate support for Israel and its actions with Judaism, which I think reasonable people don't. And so it seems to me, and of course we've seen this around the globe too, in Germany and in other countries, that protest is treated like an enemy insurgency. And it seems to me that this all, when you extend your military like this in a, dare I say, a quasi-colonial way halfway across the globe, that one of the consequences of that may be that you also wind up extending military-like behavior onto your own population. Does that make sense to you?
Well, unfortunately, it does make sense and has so many historic parallels. Of course, at least the highest profile in the last many decades was the military, the National Guard, killing protesting students at Kent State, and also less publicized, two killed at Jackson State, a black college in the South. So we had six, so to speak, martyrs of the militarism on campuses because people had the temerity to protest a U.S. war. And I think it's a notable and pretty outrageous travesty the way overall news media and the administrators of colleges have treated the upsurge of protest against the mass murder by the US supported Israeli military since last spring. And the loose, to the point of ludicrous, definition or treatment of what is anti-Semitic. I mean, I've read and heard the claim, which has been echoed not only from right-wing media, but places like CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post, that if students critique Zionism, that's anti-Semitic. Well, if we buy into that, then it's ideas of any sort that are not favorable to the Israeli state, then that is equated with being anti-Semitic. And I think, we could sum up really pretty quickly what the scam is. An Israeli government that is engaging and has engaged in ethnic cleansing, at this point, genocide in Gaza, wraps itself in the Jewish religion, and then when criticized for its actions, says that the criticism is anti-Semitic. I mean, it's a pretty simple formula. And once it is accepted, then all sorts of demagoguery takes place.
I think that's exactly right, Norman. And I think that extends, that formula is applied in different ways to suppress dissent and even information. I was thinking, for example, reading the afterword and following the news and now talking with you about it, I was thinking about the fact that I have struggled personally in writing about some of the misinformation that's been spread. For example, that Hamas instructed its fighters to systematically rape Israeli women. Very, very sensitive topic. As anti-Semitism is a sensitive topic, these should be sensitive topics. And to me, part of the strategy is I feel entrapped sometimes, because if I want to point out that probably rapes did occur, it's horrifying, but there's no evidence of anything systematic. Oh, and by the way, in 1 year alone, 2021, the Israeli military was accused of more than 1,000 acts of sexual violence against Palestinian prisoners. The response, even internally, interestingly enough, is what? You don't care about, women who are victims of sexual violence. Of course I care. I passionately care, but it almost feels as if that's being used against me, or the false stories about murdered babies. Every child's death, any innocent person's death is horrifying. That's why I oppose what's going on. But somehow, as with the anti-Semitism canard, it becomes a minefield. Sorry to use the militaristic analogy. It becomes a minefield to try to just sort this out and speak out fearlessly without self-doubt. It's almost like I could use guidance on this.
Well, it shouldn't be such a subversive approach to say that we insist on a single standard of human rights and that we don't apply one standard to certain governments and then we set it aside or invert it for other governments. And often the most powerful form of propaganda is silence. We just don't hear about it. Even reading the Israeli daily paper Haaretz, we see all kinds of stories that would literally almost never get into the New York Times or the Washington Post. And the documentation of the sexual violence, the torture by the Israeli government, the fact that it's well documented seems to make very little difference in terms of the so-called mainstream US media. And that's, of course, where the Zero Hour and other alternative sources of media that are not encumbered by this touchstone of orthodoxy of US foreign policy, it's more important than ever. And I think that the fact of younger people demographically being much more opposed to Israel's war on Gaza is a testament to how important the messaging is. And also it helps explain some of the panic from groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which actually functions as a defamation of Palestinian League, frankly. These are groups, or AIPAC, that are very sensitive to the trends. They're worried about younger people, and they continue to redouble their efforts to stigmatize protests for human rights as anti-Semitic.
And I guess, as we start to maybe wrap up, part of the challenge, what we've just been talking about, Norman Solomon, for the last few minutes, is sort of escaping the rhetorical and propaganda traps that are laid. But then there's a sort of process of discerning a shape through the fog of misinformation, right? Which is one of the themes of your book. And to me, part of it has to do with what you said at the outset, that there is a military machine, that it has arms in multiple parts of, meaning extensions in multiple parts of the world, including Israel, and that we have a skewed view. You talked about the Houthis. To much of the world, the Houthis are heroes. They're fighting an oppressive system, and they're doing so where it hurts by making shipping more expensive, by increasing the cost of transport. And, a piece I never finished, maybe I will, was about the fact that the U.S. military operation to stop the Houthis was named Operation Prosperity Guardian. And to me, it's like, do you feel prosperous? Would be one response, but it suggests, albeit unintentionally, an unholy association between that military machine and American economic interests around the world, which, also have been affected certainly by the Palestinian situation. Biden was working on extending Donald Trump's Abraham Accords and creating trade routes through Saudi Arabia, and Dubai and elsewhere through Israel. And it seems to me that the last piece of the puzzle, for me, at least in my process, and very, very much helped by your book, War Made Invisible, is to sort of name the elephant in the room and say, that's not a hippie delusion that was, and wake up and be a real world kind of person. It's a realistic assessment of the world we're in, and it's something we can't change until we recognize that it's realistic. And I was wondering what your thoughts were in that about that.
Absolutely. The realism is crucial. I closed the initial edition of the War Made Invisible book by quoting James Baldwin, who says that not everything that we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so, a realistic view of where we are, I think of it metaphorically as if we have an accurate map of the political, social, international terrain, then at least we know where we are. We know where the various people and forces are situated, and we can navigate it more effectively than if we have a delusional map that is about how the United States is a paragon of virtue for human rights, which is a preposterous map. If you followed that map, you'd crash into a mountain if you were in a plane piloting it. It's so the realism is just so crucial, and it's understandable that a lot of people would rather not subject themselves to the grim realities and really look at it. But it's essential because, again, it's not sufficient to gauge the real policies of the United States, but it is necessary. It's a precondition for building movements that are dealing with actual real foreign policy, the realities of foreign policy, rather than the fantasies that are spun out. One thing that you mentioned, Richard, which I think is really notable, that about the Houthis, and for that matter about Hezbollah, they have been explicit, both of those forces, that if the United States stopped helping Israel to slaughter people in Gaza, if the slaughter of people in Gaza ended, then Hezbollah would have stopped shelling Israel, and the Houthis would have stopped shelling the ships in the Red Sea. And you can hardly ever find that. And, it's sort of a side note in media where that should be in the headline all the time. So, at any rate, I think that obviously this is not the world we want. It's the world we're in. And we may as well come to terms with it, not by being passive, but by being realistic and organizing to change the world for the better.
I think that's well said, and there are so many more questions I could ask you, but we're out of time. So I'll remind listeners that the book is War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, now in paperback with an afterword about the Gaza war, the Gaza attack. The author, Norman Solomon. Norman, thanks for writing the book, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.